Our first two speakers this morning will be pretty familiar to all of you. Thomas Woltz is the principal of Nelson Byrd Woltz Landscape Architects from Virginia, USA. Thomas serves on the board of directors for the Cultural Landscape Foundation, and he was named Design Innovator of the Year by the Wall Street Journal in 2013. And Rachel de Lambert, landscape architect, partner at Boffa Miskell, are going to talk to us about Cornwall Park. So please welcome to the stage Thomas and Rachel.
Thanks, Henry. I have some voice, but not quite as much as usual. So I have a sponsor's product. I couldn't find the whiskey. I don't know where Sasha Cole got that from, but Curry Park's water might help me through the session. I am quite impressed to see so many of you here. Friday the 13th, 9 a.m. in the morning, first thing. It was kind of stacked against us, but it is good to see you here. This talk is called Design in the Middle because of the vision, if you like, for Cornwall Park 100 years on, 100 years forward. So Thomas and I are going to tag team. I'll start, Thomas will do the middle and the end. So yeah, I do it, don't I? I crack into it. So the Aucklanders amongst us will be very familiar with Cornwall Park. It's conjoined to Mangakiakea, One Tree Hill to Main. And together they're about 207 hectares. So by today's densities, that's something like 3,000 dwellings. So a large area of land in central Auckland that has been set aside for Aucklanders as open space. It's a very recognisable landscape, and the obelisk on Mangakiakea, One Tree Hill, is a reference to the relationship between Maori and early Pākehā in Auckland, in particular to Sir John Logan Campbell, who is in fact buried at the top of this manga. So Sir John was that interesting combination of philanthropist and entrepreneur in Auckland. He was known as the father of Auckland in terms of the European city, and he was widely recognised in his lifetime within the city. He set aside Cornwall Park, the land holding, but also endowment lands, which have essentially enabled the park to continue as a privately funded and delivered open space for the citizens of Auckland and New Zealand. And in doing, and in setting the land aside, the citizens of Auckland themselves wanted to recognise that gift, and they did that by contributing. The program was called a penny donation, essentially, and in doing that, they raised the funds to erect the statue, and later in the talk, Thomas will round out the story, if you like, of Campbell Crescent and the statue of Sir John. He's a 90-year-old man in that photograph. He died 6 years later. And in putting aside the land for Cornwall Park, Sir John did something else which at the time brought the overseas world to New Zealand. This is Austin Strong standing in front of his original design for Cornwall Park. Austin Strong was a San Francisco-based landscape architect, so history somewhat repeats itself in terms of the process of selection of American landscape architects to continue to work in Cornwall Park. Another sort of one of those interesting factoids is that Austin Strong was the nephew of Robert Louis Stevenson. So there's a sort of funny sort of linkage back there as well. But Austin Strong was very much influenced by the contemporary design at the time, so turn of 1901 sort of time frame. And so the parks of Olmsted, Central Park, Prospect Park, Golden Gate, but also the European parks of their time influenced the original design of the park. This is Austin Strong's plan. That was delivered in 1902, but it took some time to amass funds for the development of physical works in the park, and over the 25 years or so that amassing of funds from the endowment lands took place, the impetus to deliver the design as it sat in the Austin Strong plan was lost, but what wasn't lost was the nature of the design and its component elements. The carriageway, driveways with their planting of both native and exotic species, and also the alignment of many features of the park to connect to its wider landscape, and particularly the cultural features of the landscape, including the manga and islands of the Gulf. So many of you will also know Hochstetter's 1863 plan of the volcanic field of Auckland. And I think there are two things about this map that are really important to the thinking of Cornwall Park as a place. First and foremost, the prominence of Mangakiakia, central to that volcanic field in Auckland. But also, this map shows two cities on two harbours in Auckland. And at this time, the Manukau and Onehunga were actually more important cities or township settlements than the Waitemata based, particularly because boats from Australia used Manukau more frequently. And so the park has those frontages or connections, if you like, particularly to Onehunga and to the south. And I think in a contemporary Auckland sense, one of the things that I'm finding interesting about thinking about the park as it continues to evolve is that we know that there's a lot of growth impetus in this southern area, particularly Oranga, with the Housing New Zealand intensification, so 3 times as many people will be living in that part of Auckland very soon. And Onehunga itself, which is one of Panuku's development areas. And Onehunga Mall connects itself straight into the park and originally through the park. So I think, Auckland often has a bit of a left brain, right brain approach to its thinking about its city and the gravity of central Auckland in terms of the pull of that part of the city. And I think as part of our 100-year thinking about the future of Cornwall Park and its changing demographic and nature, this sort of southern pull is something that I'm finding interesting. So I'm going to touch on some of the ecology components in line with the theme, obviously, of this session. There are 6 guiding principles as part of the master plan, and Thomas will talk you through a lot of them. But one of them is very much based around kaitiakitanga and the stewardship in an ecological sense that the park pays to the city. And this occurs at those 3 scales of regional, city and park scale. In terms of the regional scale, Cornwall Park and its conjoined Mangakiakia really are at that scale when they are of regional significance to support the corridors of connection for New Zealand Indigenous flighted species, so birds, particularly this concept of the north and west wild link, which connects Tiriti and Mātangi through to the Waitakere Ranges, but also to the Hunuas also in the south. So at a regional scale, in an ecological sense, the park has a significant role to play, particularly the reference species in that sense are kaka, which are seen from time to time in the park, and one of the opportunities in a regional ecological sense is to increase the park service in terms of assisting kaka in that regional corridor. At a city scale, you can see how important as a green oasis the park is in an ecological sense, and how for flighted species in particular it can provide a key connection. And then again, at that park-wide scale, there are corridors of significance also within the scale of the park. So this diagram looks to capture the ecosystem of the park itself in both its exotic and indigenous qualities, the concept of time and the temporal qualities of the park, and also some of its key components. And I think one of the things about Cornwall Park is its perception as a very manicured and sort of European landscape in many ways. But New Zealand's ecology is very small, and it often requires a level of small-scale messiness to really capture the habitat opportunities of the park. And I think many of the moves for ecology in the park are at that very small, and in fact creating more of the things that are less what you would associate with the park in terms of dead wood, leaf litter, and small-scale habitats. In undertaking what was the park's first very extensive ecological survey, one of the things our ecologists discovered was that the copper skink habitat, that's this little cricket here, he's endemic to the northern part of the North Island and New Zealand's smallest native skink. That species has set up a novel ecology in Cornwall Park, and that's due to the combination of the lava flow as it comes out to the surface in the park, and the fact that the pasture are grazed by sheep, which are light-footed in these stone fields. They don't crush the stone fields, but they keep the rocks bare and open, which means that the warmth from the rock assists the habitat, and these two coexist in a way that has set up a sort of cross exotic indigenous habitat mutual assistance. So one of the moves in the park sense is to really make connections to reinforce that piece of the ecology of the park, to link up the corridors of the boulder fields and the paddocks, but also the stone walls, which are part of that service, and to ensure that that habitat is continued to be protected and grown. I don't know if Sam Bourne's in the audience today, but this diagram always reminds me of Sam. He was involved in the project at the time when this skink link idea came through. The concept is both to grow habitat opportunities in the park, but also to make the community of users more aware of what those special attributes are. And so in those places where our skink link corridors connect across pathways, we're looking to establish underpasses essentially for skinks, and then to use them also as a monitoring opportunity for the species that we don't want to see, so that we can make sure that the rats aren't sitting at the end of the skink link and eating our skinks. We want to be protecting them, not setting them up on a food conveyor. So I guess there's a lot of thinking of bringing together the component elements of creating and growing habitat, making it overt to the community so that they understand more about the ecological service of the park, but then also in the monitoring and pest control, joining those things up as well. Back to Austin Strong's plan, and he had this far corner of the park, the Ngāhere, so the concept of bush in the park was important to him. And as in much of the design of the simple clarity of Austin Strong's design was aesthetic as well as environmental, and this concept of using the bush to put the maunga into relief. The plan involves a range of diversification for the forest of the park, some planting, but also looking to grow the range of native species, so in this case epiphytes and native species, particularly native orchids in the canopy. Looking also to understand the feeding opportunities of the park. So I'm not expecting you to read this. The key red species there for the park in terms of native throughout the year foraging are nikau, Tarairi and Puri, but also in the yellow at the bottom you can see that in that winter part of the year it's the exotic species that really help to provide service in the park as well. So understanding that combination of native and exotic, looking to set aside more messy areas in the park on some of the hedgerows so that you can have falling dead branches that aren't going to kill people in a park sense, but that are also important to the service of ecology. And then this last diagram from my part, really linking together this concept of ecological service for Cornwall Park, understanding that predator control is something that we will never be able to stop doing because of its urban context, but that's a really important part of maintaining the ecologies within the park, the seasonal phenology and this regional linkage. So I think Thomas will do his segue. I'll take my water.
Thanks. Kia ora. Good morning, everyone. I want to build on what Rachel is talking about and today illustrate a few examples of the bridge, starting with the ecology that Rachel has outlined and how there can be, in the eye of a designer, a link between the ecology that shaped a site and the culture that then enters a long-term dialogue with the site. I'm going to define culture today as the trace our human species leaves on the land and engages in those ecologies to shape the land. When Lambert Woltz started working in New Zealand 16 years ago, we had a very heroic reception from Pakeha farmers in the east coast of the North Island and a very cold reception from the Maori iwi. That very quickly inverted as the Pakeha farmers were shocked at our goals of restoration ecology and our passion for native plants and native stories, and we developed a very deep and important relationship with the Ngāti Manuhiri of Gisborne region, and that has been now a 17-year-long, very deep friendship. It was a funny inversion coming as an American and finding much more resonance with Maori culture and history and rapport with nature than with my own people's rapport with nature in this country. So it was a very exhilarating way to come into a new land, a new culture, and a new ecology. Since then, and many projects later, we've now opened an office in Melbourne, and Paul Appleton is directing that office. Bringing the things that we've learned here back to the States and things from the States here has been a very exciting dialogue. No better example than the collaboration with Boffa Miskell at Cornwall Park. I've always felt our firm was terribly out of fashion. We weren't really interested in stripes and lumps and patterns, but we were very, very interested in cultural history. And looking back at history in the era of my training was deemed not so interesting. And why look back? We're all about the future. And I think we know ourselves better when we know where we came from. We set a better and more appropriate roadmap for the future of our species. And by learning the lessons of the past, we look more clear-eyed at the future. So, terribly out-of-fashion person to look 100 years back at a park, and we use that as a strategy, this kind of audacious idea of, how dare you plan for a 100-year future? Well, it's a great tool, and I suggest you consider it, because chances are the capital budget can't think audaciously in a 2-year span. But if you think on the scale of 100 years, everyone says, well, sure, let's consider that. Because 100 years from now, who knows what our rapport with cars will be, with parking lots, with the ecologies that shape our city. So with that introduction, the very first step we took in understanding Maungakiakia and One Tree Hill Domain and Cornwall Park, our only commission was Cornwall Park, but it's such an important and powerful neighbor, we needed to dig in and understand it as well. We had zero design, say, or input on that part of the landscape, but the photograph that you're seeing is Malcolm Patterson and me 6 years ago, I guess, as he was at that point on the forming, now it's the Tupunamonga Authority, but then it was the Tamaki Collective representing the Ngāti Whātua. And Malcolm took our whole team from MBW to many, many different historic sites and cultural landscapes to start to understand the power of that rapport with land. And it was really the way of building a vocabulary for entering the project. I'll highlight a few of these guiding principles that came out of those exercises with multiple representatives from the Tamaki Collective. The Tiaki Onomata, I think, is one of the very important ones that builds on what I was just saying about looking at history. I think we can look at history in a way that does not recreate any moment in history, but rather inspires us for a powerfully contemporary future. The Keitiakitanga is what Rachel's already discussed. Tikanga, I think, is another one that you also understand in these public landscapes that we have to have a deep commitment to. I liked Turango Wewe as a place to stand. This Cornwall Park has always been a bit elusive or perhaps even misunderstood in the minds of Aucklanders. No rates that anyone pays in the city goes to the spectacular maintenance of Cornwall Park. It goes to the domain, it goes to other public parks and landscapes, but this is truly private land maintained in service to the public, thanks to the trust and legacy of Sir John Logan Campbell. It's a magnificent and unusual gift for the public realm. So the heroic task of maintaining the tree collections, all of the grounds, in service to us, the public, is a really remarkable gift. Breaking down some of those misunderstandings or the idea that it's kind of an elite place with this mysterious underpinning is what led to this idea of a place to stand and a place of belonging. And a lot of the work of the master plan has been building on the qualities of the park and amplifying those, not dramatically changing them. So better sports facilities, better ecological diversity, telling more clear stories about Maori culture and influence within the park, as well as honoring the European legacy and heritage of Sir John. So one of the interesting things 100 years in is this is Cornwall Park when it opened to the public. And you're seeing Grand Drive, which was the initial driveway coming up to where the Acacia Cottage is today. So we're going from a rural park to now a suburban park. And 100 years from now, we have to be thinking this might just be a densely urban park. Right now it's surrounded by lifestyle blocks, 1-story, 2-story. It could be someday surrounded by very tall buildings when you think of the history of New York City. So that's a tracing of Green Lane, which is kind of surprising, and Grand Avenue. It's a good reminder that all of these trees that we see, they're in a cycle of life. They were planted, they will die like all of us, and our job is to replant the next generation. So we live in a funny culture, I think, where we think about the every tree is sacred, and as much as I'm an ultimate tree hugger and believe that, I think it's even more empowering to have an awareness of the cycles of life, that sometimes it's the concept of the tree that's important, and you replant it and you replant it, and you make way for the next centuries to replant these landscapes. Here, just to highlight that combination that Rachel was saying of the body of the earth in Cornwall Park and Maungakiakia, as well as these very distinctly European intrusions. There's another unbelievable factor for me as an American coming to an urban park and seeing that hundreds and hundreds of acres are managed by livestock in the middle of a city of a couple million people. This is a fantastic idea, I think. The even distribution of nutrients, no sound of mowers, weed eaters, line trimmers, and just, maintaining Cornwall Park sounds like this. And so, which is lovely, I think. But also hosting a wide array of cultures. We often in New Zealand, over the 16 years we've been working here, we're in the Pakeha Maori discourse. Well, Auckland is an incredibly diverse city, embracing many different cultures from around the world, from the Japanese celebration with the cherry blossoms, the sort of European or Dutch idea of the tulips and their explosion, even dances commemorating World War I and World War II. These wonderful events that happen in the park. And then looking across the 100 years of history, seeing how much of this landscape has been manipulated. This was the American hospital built in the war, and you can see Rangitoto in the distance there. Massive, massive footprint. And I think the last buildings were demolished in the 70s, so it's not that long ago. We did trace in yellow and red. Red is asphalt, unfortunately, and yellow is disturbed and leveled land. So we thought future interventions for new amenities within the park should fall within these already disturbed lands. So this is the result of a couple of years of work and our collaboration with Director Michael Ayrton, the 4 trustees of Cornwall Park, and the team at Boffa Miskell and Lambert Woltz. So I'll start with Campbell Crescent. Moving through this landscape, we're proposing, we really want to tear out asphalt from the center of the park and get it to the perimeter so that you park and walk in, more like a Central Park approach instead of driving right to the center and having acres of asphalt. So 250 cars here, several hundred cars in a proposed garage, bowls, rugby pitch, cricket. So really reorganizing those fields into a world-class sport facility with sports hub and buildings servicing those. And then a rather audacious idea of taking the cultural landscape trace of Grand Avenue that now dead ends into the park office. You cross Green Lane and it picks up here as a walk, and proposing a land bridge that would go up and over Green Lane. So honoring that cultural landscape of the plan, but lifting it in 3 dimensions up and over Green Lane. A very heroic move, but one that could finally stitch the park north and south back together. So removing the big asphalt parking lot here and making a promenade that would connect to the drill field, a restoration of that drill field, remembering the history of the hospital, coming up to a cultural precinct of museum and overlook, restoring the ellipse of Campbell Lawn, coming here to a new park hub that would be essentially a farm center to celebrate and tell the story of using livestock and agricultural practices, part of New Zealand's heritage, to maintain this public park. This is one of the many things that our firm has learned in New Zealand and taken back to the United States, and we are breaking the law in Nashville, Tennessee with glee. It is illegal to do farming in the city, so we have replaced mowers with moors, and are rotationally we have a proposition to rotationally graze livestock as a maintenance strategy for open space in the public realm, not as farming. So as long as you take the word farming out, the mayor was like, I gotcha, we can do this. So that was pretty great. So, sorry, I went, these are the new fields. Focusing the cricket pitch from this graded landscape of the cricket pitch, you have an axial view to the titi of Maungakeakea. The sports fields, the statue that Rachel mentioned, and I thought I'd walk you through some of the improvements that you can see happening right now. So far we've built this new arcing sidewalk. All that was here was the fountain and bollards around it. And we felt that was too tight to the fountain, so we're proposing a new circle with stone walls, these graceful arching paths that bring you from Manukau Road, or a very ceremonial stair that brings you up this way. This is the ADA access, and this is the walking access. And then there's a funny crank of access, and then bringing that into Pururi Drive. We've already necked this down to slow traffic. All of you who are speeding, shame on you, please stop. It's very dangerous. And then replacing the Lombardy poplars. One of the things we loved was from Austin Strong's plan was using native plants in European boulevards and alleys. And it was a kind of interesting cross-cultural stitch. So in that spirit, we replaced the exotic Lombardy poplars that were very much at the end of their lives and starting to break up with 3 native species. So Totora will be one of them, mixing and Pururi, mixing them as a mixed double alley around the arc. So replacing the idea, but with a species more in keeping with the original design. This is a sketch of what that looks like with big dramatic drifts of native plants, where you have several hundred in large drifts of plantings, not a sort of polka dot method, but really celebrating the native plants at the front door to the park. There you can see the Puri, Koi Koi, and Totora laid out in this new walk. And all of the Koi Koi are planted, and the rest will be coming soon. So watch for ongoing improvements at Campbell Crescent. This is the land bridge coming up and over to the esplanade. These were just some of the inspirations. We could do a brittle walkway, some precedents for that. a highly constructed realm, or even be inspired by wildlife technology, wildlife crossings, where you just lift the ground up and over the road so that there's a sort of seamless park connection. This is Grand Drive, so making a schedule for the replanting of those, and in this case, Grand Drive was a mix of native and exotics and continuing that heritage as well. This is the proposal for the park hub and farm center, where you'd have maintenance equipment, livestock handling, but a new offering, which would be acres of vegetable production, to start to talk about urban agriculture, connect people to where their food comes from, probably with a volunteer force, but to also celebrate the incredible heritage that we learned about of Maori cultivation of vegetables at Maungakiakia. So this is very much part of the tradition of this cultivation on the flanks of the volcano. This, you can't really see, all of this area is grazed by sheep. So the steeper slopes are sheep, and the flatter plains are larger grazers and cattle. So this is a plan of that. You can see at the closest point to One Tree Hill, featuring Maori traditional methods of cultivation of vegetables, and then more Western, but showing them together and honoring both at the same time, which has really been the story for the 100 years of Cornwall Park, this hybrid culture. So being inspired by these kinds of traditional agriculture and these kinds of traditional agriculture, and blending the two. There are lessons to be learned from both. And the whole, operating with grazing, education, and this connection to food in the landscape, we think is taking something incredible that Cornwall Park's been doing for a century and amplifying that into the 21st century and connecting it to urban agriculture. Our hope is that we have created a roadmap for a 100-year vision for the future of the park that does not recreate but amplifies the extraordinary past. You can only do that by deeply caring about that ecological and cultural heritage. I thought I would include, can our tech friends, can you let me know the time? The timer's not on. I just want to make sure I don't go. 18 minutes. 18? Ah, I got days. But I'm still going to go quickly. This is the Brooklyn Naval Yard Cemetery. I wanted to include a couple of examples where this idea of looking at the ecology of a place and the traces where that ecology has created a distinct culture, and that those cultural stories may have been lost or buried in the landscape. I think the landscape has the unique ability to convey these messages to the public, but it also has a unique fragility. If we don't tend the landscape, these stories and traces will be lost. So I think it is incumbent upon us as professionals to steward these stories. But in my country, we have lied for a very, very long time. We've lied about the landscape of slavery, the landscape of oppression, the oppression of women, and so much has been done over the 19th and 20th century to hide these true stories. And I think our firm has reinforced its deep commitment to finding these stories, discovering them, and opening them up for the public to understand in the hopes of a more resilient, culturally resilient future, a future of understanding, and the truth is the only way to get there. How you find that is through this looking to history. What it yields, I hope, is a deeply authentic response to the landscape, rather than pattern making and something of fashion. So the Brooklyn Naval Yard Cemetery is an interesting story. In 1766, the Navy was built in this area. The Revolutionary War was yet to come. James Cook had not made it to New Zealand yet. It's a kind of an amazing period in New York's history. This map shows the red circle where the Naval Yard Cemetery is. The Brooklyn Naval Yard was the ship manufacturing arsenal for New York Harbor, just south of Manhattan. But what you're seeing here are agricultural fields. You're seeing the land that was taken from the Native Americans when the Dutch settled. So you already have this deeply layered cultural landscape. In digging into this history, we found these images from the district where the park is of cherry cultivation. And cherry was a major crop by early immigrant settlers to Brooklyn. We also found this old map showing the hospital building. The Naval Yards are all to this area. The doctor's house, the hospital was built in the late 1700s out of white marble. It's a really spectacular building in very bad disrepair at this point. A garden, and then this was the burying ground. But you're also seeing this area of a meadow and sedges called Wallabout Creek, which was a shallow sort of marginal wetland in this sinuous pattern through the site. That wetland was later drained when they had to expand the cemetery. And the cemetery was filled with botched surgeries, with dead soldiers, and with the indigent poor from the neighborhood. Several thousand bodies, the names of whom we do not know. So the idea that bodies are beneath our feet, they're everywhere. Every human that's existed on the earth is somewhere still within the earth. And again, like I mentioned with trees earlier, I think, not to be morbid, but an awareness of our fragility, an awareness of these cycles of life links us to the earth in a very powerful way. We thought this is sacred ground where these bodies have been buried. It had been agricultural land, it had been Native American hunting ground, it had been a wetland, it had been graded out by the Navy to be ball fields. The bodies were all exhumed, several thousand bodies taken to another cemetery outside the city. And every now and then while playing, I call it soccer, every now and then a finger bone would pop up from the ground, so they hadn't been quite so thorough in their removal. So when the Naval Yard was developed, the developer said, you know, we don't really want the cemetery, and we're so generous. We will give it to the Brooklyn Greenway Initiative, which is an 18-mile bike line that runs through. So they were going to make a small park, because, you know, the developers, they want to develop. You can't really touch the ground here. So the brief was make a park, but don't touch the soil or the ground. Like, you can't excavate at all. So if you start to think about that, that's a pretty hard challenge to make a 3-acre public park in the middle of Brooklyn and you can't touch it. So the one ecology that saved our hide is warm season grassland meadows. And we've been for 20 years establishing those. It's our most fragile and rapidly disappearing ecology in the United States. So we've been reestablishing those in thousands of acres now. So we thought, well, let's do one in the city. And the way you establish it is by scraping off the vegetation, not excavating, and then pressing the native seeds into the top of the soil. And you don't cover them at all. They germinate. They spend 3 years putting roots down into the ground. These native grasses in the States will develop root systems that are 4 meters deep. They're incredible. And then you burn them with fire and they regenerate. You can also mow them or use ruminants like we're doing in Nashville illegally. I love breaking the law. I never knew it could be so fun. I've been too much of an Eagle Scout my whole life. So you're seeing the park here, but what we also did was we mapped all the urban rooftop farms that are in Brooklyn within a 2-mile radius, knowing that bats, moths, bees, and birds can fly that distance. So could this little park become a way to connect to the cycles of life? Could we invest in the ecology that draws and attracts more life than any other ecology of a wildflower meadow as a metaphor for the loss of life? So the memorial here is to draw all of the life at every scale possibly to the park. So we looked at the flowering seasons, what we could get of all native plants and the pollinators that they're connected to. This is a plan. You can see this boardwalk. It rests lightly on the soil with nothing but, it's called diamond footings. They're little geodesic domes with meter-long nails that go into the ground at angles, so it resists wind uplift. So a boardwalk that runs sinuously through a meadow with drifts of native planting. We got permission from the state of New York to excavate 1 cup holes, we did follow the rules, 1 cup holes to plant little cherry seedlings of our native black cherry, which is a towering, beautiful tree. So this will become a sacred grove. This circle is crossed by mooring blocks, the giant granite boulders that would have held the ropes for ships. And this gently reminds us of Wallabout Creek that was drained once to expand the cemetery. So this is the result. It was a very affordable project. This is not a heroic project at all, but one that by looking at the past, looking at the culture, and looking to ecology, we come up with a very contemporary solution for a more resilient future. The result is a river of wood flowing through a sea of grass. This was the first year. Immediately, the hipster generation of Brooklyn knew exactly what to do with this beautiful new green space in the middle of a dense city. You know, this is truly an oasis in the middle of the city. And here it is 2 years on. You can see the fecundity of the wildflowers, the pollinators. We have beehives here, and we have Brooklyn Naval Yard honey now, which is very nice. A small amphitheater, you can see, again, very affordable, not fancy materials, everything pretty much off the shelf, but because we're designers, everything is lined up. Marvel Architects did the entry pavilion and collaborated with us on the boardwalk. So here it is in its fecund splendor. You can see the mooring blocks running through the meadow, the entry pavilion. It's a very simple little project, but it's come to mean a lot to the volunteer corps that comes to manage the invasive plants in the meadow. Just a nice shot of it. You can see an act of pollination about to happen. Autumn, looking back to this circle, and each of those stakes is one of our little wee cherry trees that will get to 30 meters tall. And the result is joy. I love this picture of this girl hopping on the mooring blocks and enjoying this space, and she is happy. She is surrounded by health and life in a place of the dead. There is nothing sad here, but it is a celebration of the unavoidable human condition of death in the reassurance of beauty and life everywhere around you. The last example that I wanted to show you is reconnecting to the theme of water today. And another example of this ecology to culture research. This is Centennial Park in downtown Nashville. The park, but you can see we've been at work. You can see this was a phase 1 parking, and this is phase 1. Right now we're going into construction on the Great Lawn, the allées, a performance area, and a massive children's garden. So that's about to break ground. But this was the site of the Centennial Exposition of 1897 in Nashville, Tennessee. Nashville had, as a colonial town, had a growing population. That population had been impacted, and I'll explain that in a second. These expositions were happening in Chicago, St. Louis, Paris, New Orleans. They were the great expositions of the late 19th century, introducing things like electrical power and turbines. Each of these pavilions was made of paper mache and chicken wire and timber, made to look like palaces from Europe. When we were hired to do a master plan for the park, we were told that the only period of significance of this land was the 6 months of the exposition. And we thought, well, something happened in this land before the exposition. Let's figure out what that was and see if we can come up with some ideas. Because everything was torn down except the real Parthenon. Some people think there's one in Greece, but it's kind of all broken and looks crappy. This one is of concrete, so it's perfect. So we like to think this is the real Parthenon. And then all of these very fancy Beaux-Arts palaces were torn down. The only thing that remained was this lake and the Parthenon. Very quickly, the mayor and city council decided this land should be a park. But of course, in great style or great tradition of American states, they didn't commission anybody to design anything. They just added parking lots and grass and some trees. So 100 years later, we're hired to do a design for the park. But we wanted it to resonate with the history of Nashville. Well, as we started digging in, we found out a lot happened here, more than 6 months of paper mache. Oh, that's very blurry. Central Tennessee, I'm going to give you 3 million years in 30 seconds. Central Tennessee was a giant plate beneath the sea. The sea would dry out, deposit salt, and flood again. This was millions of years, making a giant flat center to the United States. 2 plates buckle, it rises up as a dome called the Nashville Dome, it cracks open, it's eroded by thousands of years of heavy rainfall, it erodes to become the Nashville Basin. What it did was it revealed layers of salt, limestone, salt, limestone, salt, limestone as the rivers carved through it. This attracted bison to lick the salt that was made over millions of years. The Native American tribes hunted the bison on very predictable routes. They were so worn that when colonial settlement came to Nashville, The colonial settlers put down wooden planks and made those into roads. When we started this project, we took the first colonial map of downtown Nashville and we overlaid it, of the first colonial map of Native American trails, and we overlaid it with a current city map. The primary roads are identical. The traffic in Nashville is horrible, and it's a reminder to not let bison design your city. However, it does reveal a very powerful example of this ecology to culture link, that the ecology that shaped a place led to animal behavior, led to human behavior that was copied by other humans, and then was memorialized in asphalt. This is fascinating to me, and this is deep history. So the landscape was shaped by the Mississippian Indians. These are thousands of year old beautiful mounds, ceremonial mounds, burial mounds, middens. But the reason everybody came here is actually geology. It's a karst geology, a pumicey, porous geology. Water operates in very unpredictable ways. It was fantastic for colonial settlement. You dug a long drop, it disappeared in a minute because it went into the drain, and that's great until your neighbors dig their long drops, and then everybody gets cholera. Not a fun chapter of Nashville's history. So here's Nashville in the middle of the Tennessee Basin, and that is Natchez, which is along the Mississippi River doing trade with France. Remember, the Louisiana Purchase had not happened, so France went all the way to the Pacific Ocean, and Napoleon didn't know how big it was. Jefferson had a good guess and bought it. So goods and services from Nashville went down the Cumberland River and then the Mississippi all the way down, there's the river, all the way to Natchez. People would walk back to Nashville. We found letters from the earlier workers on these boats in the 1700s saying, we knew we were home when we got to the cool, clean waters of Cockrell Spring. Like, where's Cockrell Spring? Because Centennial Park is at the end of Natchez Trace Road. So that's pretty interesting. And who the hell's Cockrell? In a deed search of the land that was in the park, we found that Anne Cockrell was the owner in the 1700s, 1770. She was the first woman of colonial America to have free deed and title of land west of the Appalachian Mountains. She also ran this farm by herself. She also pulled gunpowder up the Cumberland River to Hessian soldiers in the Revolution against England. This woman should not be forgotten. And in fact, this park is filled with the stories of powerful women. Tennessee was the deciding vote in women's right to vote at the federal level. And it was a march in this park to the doors of the Parthenon that represented democracy in the West that led to Harry Burns changing his vote on the floor of Congress because he read his mama's letter to him out loud to Congress. And she said, you cannot with good conscience prevent women from voting. This all happened in the park. So these stories of women were very powerful. I digress, back to water. This is a map of the plumes of cholera death in the city. This is why the exposition happened. They then invested in the first sand filtration plant in America, one of the very first, in 1877. This is a giant fortress filled with sand that cleans the water, and then it's pumped to houses. So it's a huge technological advancement in urban water. They then piped, unfortunately, creeks and rivers because they had come to understand that cholera and water were associated. But this innovation in technology led to the hiding of an ecology. And now in our century, with the resolution of cholera, I think it's our job to restore those ecologies that were damaged. So we found this article, and this guy is marking this, pointing to this just place on the ground. This is old school editorial sticker, X. But we could count the posts and figure out roughly where we are, found the roots of this now gone tree, and we could triangulate to figure out where Cockrell Spring was. This was Anne Cockrell Spring, where she built her farm that she managed as this heroic colonial woman, and we found it. We dug, we excavated, and at the bottom, nothing like a bunch of designers looking in a hole. I just love that picture. And so we set about revealing the water of the spring. Guess what? 120 gallons a minute pumped straight to the sewage treatment plant. So, an amphitheater here for outdoor music, and then paths that lead you to a small terrace, the daylighted spring in the exact spot where it occurred, with the 4-foot square limestone wellhead from Anne Cockrell's day that we found excavated. It was about 6 feet down, excavated and brought it up, but we didn't make a babbling, quaint brook. We set it into a very contemporary frame. Then built a constructed rill, a level spreader with a constructed wetland to increase the biodiversity of the of the park. And then this will continue in future phases, but all the water goes to the lake, where it is then repumped as irrigation for the whole park. So we are offsetting 1 million gallons of treated drinking water that was being pumped as irrigation onto the park, simply because we did our cultural homework. We did our research to find this story, we daylighted an authentic spring, and we now use that water to apply to the park. This was the rendering. This was the idea of a tank, the constructed rill, the constructed wetland, and the views to the Parthenon. And this is it built, so all very similar from the rendering. People should trust our renderings, is the lesson there. And this is the park, this little piece of the park as it exists today. This is the real wellhead from the late 1700s, a plunge tank, and this is all about kids playing, and kids go nuts in this landscape. This is the constructed wetland, and this is the diagram for coming out of the tank. Here we have backup to repump, and then this is that piece that goes all the way to the lake and then into the irrigation scheme for the whole park. So we have a sustainable and ecologically sensitive source of water to offset the irrigation needs for this public landscape. We love to place these secret clues that you have to kind of figure out why at one end of this extrusion of rock is Natchez, and at the other end, Nashville. It reminds us of the Natchez Trace, which locates this park in space. And my last slide is the endorsement of this child. And Rachel keeps thinking that is me, and it's not. That would be really hard to have designed this and go back in history. But I think our hope in revealing these stories is to really inspire a future generation. And if this child, by coming here, learns something about themselves and why they are in Nashville and what Nashville is made of, how Nashville functions, then we've done a good job. If that child grows up to be a landscape ecologist or a hydrologist or a landscape architect, just because they were in something authentic that told them the story of their city. Thank you so much for having me.